Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and I am here today in my coziest getup to talk about another cozy activity, which is rereading books. Now, I don't know how often I've mentioned this on my channel before, but I am actually not a big rereader. I would like to be. There are so many books that I would like to go back and revisit, but there are also so many new books that I want to discover that a part of me feels like I can't reread the ones that I want to reread because then I will never get around to those new books either. It's a very difficult balance to strike, but I thought maybe I would talk through some books I am considering rereading and maybe that would help me come to a decision on it. Firstly, there are two books that I am considering rereading, or at least would like to in theory, because of their adaptations that are coming out this year. Firstly, I don't think I'm actually going to reread this, but I would love to be able to reread Tom Jones by Henry Fielding before we get the new adaptation. In the US, it's coming out on PBS, I believe, at the end of April. And it looks really interesting, and I'm really excited for it. I, of course, love the original film as well with Albert Finney from the 60s, I think. I read this back in 2017, and I really, really liked it. So I'd love to reread it again before that adaptation comes out, but because it is so massive, I don't think that's going to happen before April. I have also been thinking about rereading The Color Purple by Alice Walker. I loved it when I read it. It might have also been 2017 or possibly early 2018. But I loved it. It is beautiful. It is highly acclaimed for a reason. And the movie musical is coming out, I believe, at the end of this year. And I've heard bits of that on the Broadway radio station on my commute, and it is just stunning, just as stunning as the book. But it made me realize that there are long sequences that I don't remember from the book. I remember every moment that is highlighted in one of those songs, but I don't exactly remember how they got to that point. So part of me wants to reread this before I go see that film. Of course, one set of rereads that I always end up doing are Jane Austen rereads, thanks to Jane Austen July. That readathon always kind of forces me to reread Austen's original novels, and I'm so glad that it does because it has proven that she really is one of my favorite authors of all time, because I always love her books when I reread them. But this Jane Austen July, I may also reread Jane Austen Made Me Do It, which is a collection of short stories from many different authors who are also Janeites. My personal favorites being Amanda Grange, who wrote the series of books that looks at each of Austen's heroes and writes their diaries. So there's Mr. Knightley's diary, Captain Wentworth's diary, Henry Tilney's diary, so on and so forth. Stephanie Barron, who wrote the Jane Austen mystery series. Laurie Vieira Riegler, who wrote the Confessions of a Jane Austen Addict series. And so many more authors contributed short stories, playing with Austen's novels, either playing with unusual perspectives from characters that we don't often hear from, playing with placing those characters in modern settings. I remember loving it at the time, and I love the description every time I revisit this book to describe it on my channel, but I haven't reread the actual stories in ages, so I might do that this year. And then I have a collection of books that I remember absolutely loving that I would love to revisit, but part of me is kind of frightened too, because there's that part of me that's afraid that they won't be as good as the first time I read them. Which is silly, because what I remember of them makes them fantastic no matter how many times you read them. The first of those is Small Island by Andrea Levy. I sped through this on a road trip, and I remember absolutely loving it. The ending is still seared in my memory, but I don't exactly remember the bits in the middle that got us to that ending. So I would love to reread this at some point. It's the story of Hortense and her husband, who are Jamaican, and her husband is drafted into the RAF for World War II, and afterwards he and Hortense move to England. And she has always been taught that England is the motherland and knows everything about it, but when she gets there, she's not made to feel as welcome as she thought she would be. And it's also the story of the couple who is lending them rooms, Queenie and her husband, who I think is also an RAF pilot. And it's how their lives intertwine in the late 40s. And it's stunning. If you haven't read it yet, definitely read it. I may reread it at some point. A series that I love, I absolutely loved it when I was 13, was the Guinevere series by Rosalind Miles. This is the first book, Guinevere, Queen of the Summer Country. And I remember being blown away by this series. It takes the Arthurian legends and retells them relatively faithfully, but from a female perspective, number one. And number two, gives you a lot more background into the Celtic roots that Guinevere and Arthur came from and how the Christianization of the British Isles played a role in the change throughout Camelot. I remember loving that aspect. I thought they were incredibly racy at 13. I don't think they're actually that racy anymore. So I would love to reread them, but part of me is afraid that they won't be nearly as good as I thought they were at 13. I would also love to reread All Passion Spent by Vita Sackville-West. This is the only novel of Vita Sackville-West's that I've ever read. If you feel like that's a familiar name but you can't place it, she was the lover of Virginia Woolf for a long time, and also an author in her own right. And this is the story of a woman who I think has been widowed now. Yes, it's the story of a widow who always wanted to be an artist, but instead she married a statesman and became a mother and was forced to fit into that early 20th century box of womanhood. But now that her children are grown and she is alone, she starts to strike out and make her own life for herself, the one she wanted all along. And I remember being blown away by this, especially because it uses the words feminist and feminism in contexts that we use them today, and yet still feels really gentle and yet packs a punch. It's just an incredible piece, and I would love to revisit it. I also want to revisit North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell one of these days because, again, I loved it, and I know there are certain parts that are very different from the miniseries adaptation, which I also love, but I haven't actually physically read this since 2012. So it is well worth a reread. I just can't convince myself to do it, and I don't know why. I know I'm still going to love it, but there's that little part of me that is afraid that I might not. In terms of major time commitments, I would also like to revisit the Poldark series one day. I love the television series. I love the book series. Part of me is worried that now knowing how the series ends might make it pack less of a punch. The other part of me argues that that's not true at all. That's what's going to make it so comforting, is that you know what's going to happen to these characters. In some ways that might comfort me and make it less tense. In other cases it might make it even more poignant. But it is also 12 books long. So I'm gonna hold off on that for the moment, but one day I would like to reread them. Part of me is also toying with rereading Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. I read this again in 2017, 2018, and I really did not enjoy it. I found all of the characters insufferable. I thought Molly was really weak, and so I didn't revisit it for ages. But this past summer, I watched the miniseries adaptation and actually really enjoyed it. So I'm toying with the idea of rereading it because I don't know if I'm in a better headspace now to appreciate it, or was it the actors' portrayals of the characters that made them more palatable? I'm not sure. Another book I want to reread someday is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. This is an incredible book. It made the book 2 Browns back in 2017, 2018, and very deservedly. It is an incredible novel about marriage, infertility, just the human experience is crammed into this book. It is written beautifully. The actual plot around those themes is that it's about this young Nigerian couple who have decided that they do not want to have a polygamous marriage. It's something that some families do, but they have decided between themselves they do not want to bring another person into their relationship. However, they are also struggling to conceive. And her husband's family is really putting pressure on them to bring in a second wife who might be able to have a child. And it looks at the strain that that puts on their marriage. It looks at her internal turmoil. And then there's a twist that happens 2/3 of the way through that blows your mind and brings it to a whole new level. And part of me goes, well, you know the twist, it won't be as incredible. The other part of me goes, of course it'll still be amazing because the writing is so incredible. So one day I will reread this. And the last book that I'm toying with rereading, or that I wish I could reread the same way that I did the first time, is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. I adore this book. It is just perfect. It is Regency magicians. It's as if Jane Austen and Neil Gaiman co-wrote a book, and it is amazing. I think what made this even more special was the fact that it was the first time that I had truly buddy read a book. I read this with my friend Jonathan, and I was in grad school at the time, so I would bring this with me to class and read it in between classes. I went on several road trips for family weddings that summer, so there were long hours just trapped in the car with it. It is just massive. So we had a long time of loving this book, and I remember coming out of class and checking my phone and seeing texts from him saying, oh, his first name is Gilbert, that's so perfect! The most trivial things, but we loved all of those trivial things as well as all of the big things, and I don't know that anything's ever going to recreate that. But I still want to reread it nonetheless. So that is my dilemma of rereading and some books that I am toying with rereading this year or in the future in general. Let me know down below if you are a big rereader or not, or if you have any advice for me of how to overcome my circular thoughts about rereading. And I will see you soon with another video. Until then, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.